Bonjour. Vous m'entendez?
Good morning. Can you hear me? Good morning. Can you hear me? Good morning to everybody. Maybe the microphone is not working. Maybe you should just get the microphone closer. We have a sound engineer going to help us. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the team of the festival, Elena, Charlotte. Today we're going to talk, do a restoration, Effort Fake, Vérité en mensonge in French, and CHIEN ANDALOU, restorations conducted by the Cinémathèque in France. And so I want to underline some important aspects. We are pleased to have with us Fernand Alberich, who is going to talk to us afterwards of the CHIEN ANDALOU. And he replaces Marián de Egido of the Filmoteca in Spain, and he supervised the restoration in the copy of CHIEN ANDALOU, conducted by the French Cinémathèque. And he was a consultant for this project. He's going to talk about this restoration of CHIEN ANDALOU, and he will refer to the first screening organized by Noël. We are also happy to have with us Audrey Birrien, chief of the project of the Venerdì, and we have taken good decisions. As I say, the restoration is a threesome between the ones entitled and the labs. We have worked on both projects, and we are going to see various aspects of CHIEN ANDALOU. Léon Rousseau, sound engineer at the studio Diapason, restored the sound of Effort Fake, and he will talk about the difficulties that were encountered. In particular, he will talk about other works he participated in, such as Lola Montes, Les Vacances de Monsieur Hulot. And then we have Jérôme Bigueur, colorist, expert in color grading, and he will talk about his work on Effort Fake, and he will explain how he worked on the colors without obviously removing the nature of the various sources. And we had various sources at our disposal. Now, to start, the choice of these two projects, La Cinémathèque, in its attempt to restore the films, bases itself on choices that, to some extent, want to be discovering some fonts, some collections, such as Auguste François between 1901 and 1904, and the film authors that were little forgotten, such as Vincent Mizan dans un pré et S'en va dans l'autre of Pierre Zucker, and evidently with a glance at classic artists that want to offer an artistic dimension that is translated generally with personal commitment in the writing, in the script writing, and both in the form as well as the narration. From these points of view, these two films match our expectations, and the CHIEN ANDALOU marks the history of art for its dimension that is surrealist, and the film announces the obsessions of Noël. And the Cinémathèque in France has recently restored the Âge d'Or with the Centre Georges Pompidou and the Terre sans Pain with films, Le Film du Jeudi, in order to enhance and highlight together the three films that are revolutionary. As for Fake, the editing, the experimental editing of the film and innovating, guided by the voice of Orson Welles, confers the need to make a vital creation of the filmmaker that is not understood all the time. The director of the Dame de Shanghai offers remarkable work associating scenes of documentaries and fiction sequences, so anticipating the times to talk modernly about lies, art, and finally of cinema. Effort Fake is certainly the most personal film of Welles, and you're going to see it tonight in the piazza. The restoration of Effort Fake has been realized by the Astrophore and the Cinémathèque in Switzerland and the Audiovisual Institute of Monaco, with which we collaborate on various projects, as well as the laboratory Divanti. And I want to thank all these partners and especially Benjamin that has taken the choice for this film. So he is in this room and I want to thank him personally. Now I would like to pass the floor to Jérôme and Léon, but I insist on the peculiarities of the film. At the origin of the project, Reichenbach, important documentarist of the 60s and 70s, shows to Orson Welles a pre-editing of a new documentary on the fake artist Elmer Deory. And this desire and uses these sequences, and he turns them that were shot in Ibiza, and Reichenbach generously uses the images that pursues the shooting of the film. So the film is made up of different sources, sequences of documentary filmed in 16 millimeters and then brought down to 35 millimeters. And then from the point of view of grading, it has an instance knowing that these sources have been ruined in time, were damaged in time. I pass on the floor to Jérôme, how to pass on this when the Cinémathèque talked to us about a film by Orson Welles. We were very happy, and I saw the first images. I was really a little bit astonished because the scanning showed different type of negatives, internegatives. Nothing was right. So we started with the first scanning. 2 tests were performed, and with these edited negatives, so we have rescanned the interpositive. And starting from here, I always work with a reference print. We had this print, but it was completely in magenta, and we couldn't use it as a reference. Then we had the criterion published starting from an interpositive some years ago, and supervised by Dominique Alger, who is an expert that I respect a lot with great talent. So I said to myself that that print could be as a basis and a reference point, not to be working by myself in this adventure. Now, what bothered me was the fact that the film was fragmented 1,800 frames on the reels. So we called Hervé, and we had told him that 3-4 days were not sufficient for grading. I told him 3-4 days I cannot make it because each frame needs to be processed. So I certainly will not end my grading work in such a short time. Hervé understood my problem, so I managed to have more time at my disposal. Then you will understand from the video the problems because I extracted 3 minutes from the first reel, and you will see what I have discovered on the images. So let's see if we can launch this video.
Alors, il faut savoir que sur le film, j'avais 53% qui provenaient du négatif.
53% of the images came from the various negatives. Kodak, and they were produced between 1968 and 1972. And the others were internegatives, internegative stock, 71, 74, Agfa Gewert.
C'est le nombre de plans que j'avais.
You see the number of frames I worked at. The negative part matched directly the shooting by Wells. And you can see a precise, detailed image, very sharp, and you can work quite well with it. And then on the part of the editing band, it was dirtier. There were some warpings and different types of editings. And for the study, for the restoration, we decided to keep certain defects, certain flaws, in order to allow the spectator to see the differences and the moment in which, for instance, Orson Welles talks and presents, and the other moment in which we worked on the editing band talking about rhetoric.
De bruit, de réduction de grain. C'est souvent...
A reduction of the grain. The grain has not been touched. So the negative part remained. And we have kept it as if it was a positive print. There were also parts, black and white. Are there colors that were more vintage that I have kept? And with the Blu-ray, I remained in this direction, on this path. I didn't look for other pathways, but I made reference just to this material, and I worked in two installments, so to speak. The first stage was to attribute harmony to the colors and showing the elements that had been tinted, and then with the other elements, with Wells, sequence by sequence, frame by frame. I remained always with the negative part that was supposed to remain neutral, and I highlighted the differences, for instance, the scenes in Ibiza or Las Vegas.
Et on voit bien sur la partie gauche, il y a les différentes émulsions d'intérieur.
So different.
Et après de longues heures et beaucoup de réflexions, j'ai présenté mon travail à Françoise Widoff, qui était l'assistante de Reichenbach, et puis Hervé.
Presented my work to the assistant of Reichenbach, and the feedback was absolutely positive, and I was very happy. And the number of sequences, for the ones who didn't see the film, but you will realize it, that the number of frames is impressive, and the quality of grading depends a lot on the number of frames. And so when it doesn't work well, from one frame to the other, the work becomes very complicated, especially in the reels. It was really very, very difficult. It was a tough work, but we're very pleased with the end result, the grading. 10 minutes to talk about the sound. First of all, thank you for having brought us this film that is absolutely wonderful. I suggest you to go and see it tonight because it's really a beautiful film. The soundtrack of Hervé. We could start from the technical part, but it's not that interesting. We started from the original source magnetics on paper, and it was the best tool we had at our disposal. But the problem is that the magnetic has a format that has a trend to get ruined. And get ruined not in a uniform way. So the demagnetization cause the loss for acute pitches and tones that are not distributed uniformly throughout the film. So there are points in which they are in excellent format and others that are absolutely not usable. We could have added these acutes digitally with digital instrumentation. We can do miracles, but I want to draw your attention the fact that the magnetic has always been there is a good piece of news, but the magnetic track, the more we go ahead, the less will last. So a long time has elapsed since I worked on a magnetic track that would be good from one end to the other, while we have to replace the points that are of lower quality. But with the trend of going through time in a better way and surviving. So on this film, there is a start in the reel where there are not sufficient acute tones to be recovered. But the essence of the film comes from the magnetic band. So the soundtrack of this film is a mix that is rather complex, that has a quite heterogeneous sounds. There are sounds of the shooting of the documentary, so there are really sounds that are typical of documentaries. Then there is the voice of Wells that is very cinematographic, well documented, and then afterwards synchronized, because it's thanks to the post-synchronization that the first scene at the station was shot, and then the voice recorded in the studio. And then with this mix, that is a little bit handicraft or artisan type. Well, this created a sort of chaotic workload for the first days, but the magnetic track of the acutes, we had highs and lows on the track. So it's a restoration that induced us to make many decisions, also at the level of interventions and acutes and
Alors on peut se poser la question de comment
the soft blows. So we wanted to respect the original message, because the chaos of the message is a part of the film. But if there are tests in the document text that you don't understand, is something, of course, that we are disturbed. We have to respect the original message, but our mission is for the text to reach the public, and it is understandable. So finding this balance is the point, and at what point, in what proportion balance out the acute and the risk that shouldn't be too extreme. So the human voice is our reference because we know what is the approach and what is the level of a voice that whispers and a voice that screams. So the point we had was the same as for the images. So a shooting that was varied and a message that made difficult this work of grading, that guided us in our choices.
Une musique, et je ne parle pas de la musique de Legrand, mais une musique de la voix.
The music of the voice that is extremely interesting and controlled. It's controlled, but Wells controlled a lot the sound of the voice, and he says the scene is not complete, and I had the impression that it's a voice that immediately gets into the ear because there is a flow. And this creates the balance. Orson Welles' voice that is a magnificent tool, intense, end of. Well, he was also the dubber of Optimus Prime in Transformers, and this flow. The first thing to preserve in this film, which poses a dilemma that is part of the dilemmas when we face restorations of the soundtracks, that all synchronized parts are not necessarily synchronous. Post-synchronization can be might have been made very rapidly, and maybe it was not a priority. And we have points that are unstable. Now we can do it with the digital tools and synchronizing it with the movement of the mouth. So we have to stick to the different synchronization because the film was always this way. Well, in this particular film where we have this space with a musical voice, so we have thought not to touch the pace and the rhythm of the voice, because when you synchronize all syllable with the movement, with all labial movements, you touch upon the rhythm or the pace of the voice.
Ce rythme incroyable qui est le rythme du film.
So, for me, it was important to leave the rhythm of the voice that goes hand in hand with the music, and for me, it's the identity of this film, this flow, and representing and transferring the text. And then there is the point of combining it with the image. To my opinion, a film is not only image and sound, but it's the interaction between the elements. We cannot work. Afterwards, well, this is a sort of an experimental work, and it's a direct sound, a true sound. So, for sound falls, for a fake, so we needed to preserve this approach in the best of ways. Thank you. At the end, we can devote some time to questions. The questions will be afterwards. Thank you. Now we should be seeing. You have to change the microphone.
Anecdote, c'est en fait au départ on avait choisi.
An anecdote. At the beginning, we had decided to restore Hervé because it was supposed to be connected to Méliès, because we have the Méliès Museum, and our program will be very rich in the future. And we were looking for more contemporary film, because the other wizard of cinema after Méliès is Wells. And the surprising thing I realized that today it's a pretext, because F for fake in the collective awareness of many people is right there. And I believe it's important to project, to screen the film beyond the magics of the film. So I hope we can talk about the film after the screening tonight. I give the floor to Ferran, so can talk about Ancien Andalou, because it's collaboration between the Cinémathèque in France and the Spanish Cinémathèque. And I want to specify that is owed to Creative Europe that has funded the film, the restoration. So I want to thank them, because thanks to them we managed to complete the project. Ferran, I gave you the floor for this film that has marked cinema's history.
As you well know, I'm replacing Marián and Egido, the director of the Filmoteca Española. Unfortunately, she could not manage to be here because she is quarantining for COVID-19. I would like to read the notes she sent me, and I will add something myself. In 1989, the Filmoteca Española reviewed or restored the Buñuel movies for its centennial, and at the time there was no complete because there were internegative, dupe negative, and positive were there, but the source was changed vis-a-vis the original, so a restoration was launched. We looked for material present in the FIAF archives. The French film archives had kept the original negative. There are some negatives in Germany and Belgium, and two positives are kept preserved by Louis Buñuel, and they are in the Modern Art Museum of New York, and they were distributed in several, or screened on several art houses. The results of this restoration was presented in 2003 and at the Cannes Festival and Bologna Festival Cinema Ritrovato. So the two film archives worked on a project of restoration and disseminations of movies, specifically Buñuel, in order to put together the restoration projects that were found in both institutions, improve the end results vis-a-vis the state-of-the-art technology. Also, Filmoteca Española also received an assignment by the European Union, and also we reviewed the dupe negative in Spain and in France, so the two dupe negatives. The film was shot in 1929 at the time of the transition from silent to sound movies, and we can see the use of sounds and music that were played directly during the film, the screening. But we do believe the CHIEN ANDALOU is a sound movie, considering the notes of authors, Louis Buñuel, his remarks, and Dali's references. So this is a speaking movie, which also in Spanish, meaning again a speaking movie. So there were indication of Buñuel, and also the soundtrack that was used by Buñuel also changes with mixing with Wagner, another musician. And so this was a classic movie, and the music was changed according to the notes of Buñuel. And he said that he used several contributions, and in the 50s he made the music, the film sound. And although they did not really duplicate the results of the first screening, so there were 18 images per second, 18 frames per second. We all agreed on that, and the speed would have to be less than 24 frames per second. But we also decided not to duplicate the images in order to have a good frequency, but to change the speed of the projector to get the same results. The same, also the problem that this could entail enabled us not to project at 18 frames per second and not below. Also, we have a print in 16 millimeter distributed in the US, was screened at 24 frames per second with double images, with a pace of 16 frames per second. What we want to have the pristine projection. Berger purchased the film and screened it at Studio 28 as a complement of this screening of Hollywood projection, copper, without music, and 24 frames per second. For the duration, in 2003 restoration, we read a critique or review published in the Gazzetta Letteraria. Buñuel collaborated with that review. It was saying that CHIEN ANDALOU lasts only 30 minutes. We can add that we have two other points. There is a correspondence of Buñuel and John Hide that was published in 2018. A letter was published sent by Buñuel to the director of an art house, and in this letter Buñuel said he could not accept the invitation to introduce the movie and recommend that it should be screened very slowly. Another reference is a catalogue. We know since 2003 the film was shot with two cameras, one by Debris, handheld manivel with the set, and also another camera with a handle. So a manivel and handle. So just one was set and the other one was for moving images. So 32 images or frames per second, and then there was a change from 12, 16, 24, and 32, 48, 64 frames per second. And the effect on the movie is that this scene seemed to be, would be shot at 64 frames. And so the film lasted longer, and also a set of the music. We followed all the indications laid out by Buñuel, and we used the same restoration elements adopted in the 60s. And so this music that was recorded on Recuerdo and the Cuban Orchestra, an Argentinian tango. Then Tristan and Isolde by Wagner. as in the films distributed by Opera Classica, and the direction of the orchestra was by Van Berger. So we worked as a team in this restoration project. We really we tried to do the best in order to make this project quite successful. These are the notes that Marián wrote and I read. So the main difference between the restoration, photochemical restoration, and the digital restoration of today refers to the fact that there is a change of speed from 18 to 16 frames per second and the adjustment made with the music. Thank you. You can take the floor, Audrey. Thank you. Thanks for the Hervé, the French Film Archive, and the team of the Spanish archives, because they trusted us. When you work on a movie by Buñuel, we're very stressed because you want to work very well and get the best result. The 4K restoration was carried out on the work that Ferran had done on the analogical restoration of 2003. The main thing is a nitrate negative in 2 reels that were preserved in France, and the dupe that came negative that came from the 2003 restoration. And also we had 7 elements that were in the French archives, but according to several studies and analysis, we realized that these were not useful. There were fragments, other elements that came from the 2003 restoration, previous one, which, however, were not of good quality. And so Ferran found better elements. So we started from the restoration, because Ferran built all the elements. We started from the dupe, negative duplicate, and then we compared it with the negative, with the elements in the French archives. The negative we used for 2003 was mechanically prepared. We we eliminate the splices to reduce the number of splices in the different reels. So we solve different elements, then try to eliminate these splices, and also to eliminate this sticking, this glue that was coming out. So the negative of the French archives are complete with 3 sequences, 3 frames, and we took them on the restoration dupe of the print, because Ferran had access to materials of good quality, and this enabled us to complete the restoration of the film in a frame on the negative that was worn down through the time, a frame on the hotel room, and these frames were taken from the dupe negative because Ferran could have access to elements that were taken before there was this big accident, well, this blemish on the negative. So we followed the recommendation of FIAF, the 2 film archives. These recommendations and guidelines were a must. So we worked only on the damages and also the signs of time we see with the image. So I can give you some examples of the different stages of the restoration according to the FIAF guidelines.
disais, à chaque fois, vous allez voir des images.
As I told you, here we see the before and after. In order to follow the FIAF guidelines, we worked on the signs of the time, the wear and tear. There was dust that had somewhat glued on the print, on the print stock, and then you see the before and the after. The dust are stuck there. So we stabilized, and the scanner had some difficulties considering the splices. And so these are the defects that were treated, so the consolidation splice that was applied and the treatment of the warning, and also the wear, on the frame and the difference. Also, Ferran said that during the shooting, there were the slow-mo and also tricks that were made during the shooting, generating white images. And we did not treat those defects because they're not defects, but elements that appeared during the shooting on the set. So we preserved this element of the film because it was a different thing. So this is the film during the restoration. We were very close to the image. There were no zooming on the image. We kept the original framing. There was a 33 ratio, and so I wanted to add that the contribution of the digital means on this restoration enabled us to create digital elements at 16 frames per second, and also the sound, which we did not have to do. You could not do it on the analogical restoration. The film will be screened Saturday evening. So a 33 frame, and is silent with 16 frames per second, but also with the sound. So the aim of the work was to recreate, besides the distribution elements, so that the film could come to the audience, but also to comply with the ratio of the film, with the silent movie, but also with a soundtrack apart, so that we can preserve the negative of the image with the ratio 33, but in another print which is silent with a soundtrack. So you add a soundtrack, so then you cut a bit of the image on the left. So we have the two prints. I would like to underline this feature of the restoration, so that we found again the silent version, but also to have the music on the film, and also having the 16 frame per second sequence. Maybe you can say something on the music, the two scores. Buñuel wrote that about the screening of CHIEN ANDALOU, describing how he looked at the movie, because he was behind the screen. And also he had stones in his pockets. So if the audience were throwing tomatoes, he would respond throwing stones at the audiences. But he was a bit overblowing it and trying to make a joke. So he, of course, there was a screening with Dali. Well, that's what Jean Ricard says, that Dali was there. Buñuel said no, Dali wasn't there. And his wife says that instead he was sitting in the front row. It's not really a lie, maybe a white lie, or perhaps he could not remember. He could not remember well. A short span memory, let's say. So the music that Buñuel introduced was the tango from Argentina and Wagner, as we said. Well, we're talking about hypothesis, not really. We are in a blurred setting. So the presentation of the script, so the music is not really mentioned unless at the end. So there are very few remarks about the music in the script. Well, as you know, Buñuel studied cinema with Jean Epstein, and he said something very interesting. That a script for a silent movie is not written like a novel, but as a music score. So if we apply that approach to the script of Ancien Andalou, this idea of having a music score, then if we put Wagner music at the start of the movie, you see the bicycle rider. That's not the sequence that was cut, but the one that was shot afterwards, after the writing of the scenario, and this was not enclosed in the original scenario. So then we have the complete symphony of Wagner that was used, and the music is synchronized with the movie from start to end. I do think that Dali and Buñuel, who loved Wagner, both of them. If we go to the museum, there is an installation of Dali, and with an implement that is squashed, this car that was squashed, and there is the music of Wagner coming out of this scrap of a car. So the editing is made according to the rhythm, the pace of the music, as if it were a Wagner score. But there is something that obsesses me. Buñuel said that when he comes to Paris to prepare the movie, he realized, and he is really horrified by it, that the French surrealists hated Wagner. So he was very taken aback by that. I do believe that at that time Buñuel changed the frames, the scenes, and decided not to use Wagner all the time on the score, and wanted to be a bit provocative, which is typical of that time. There is to say, to mix Wagner music with other pieces, something to be very provocative. Yeah, it was very shocking to do that, you know, to mix all the music together. So to be really contrasting, he wanted to have a deeper tone in the music to add on the film. And so he added tango. So he had a mix between Wagner and tango. So I think that this is an hypothesis, of course, but still that could be quite interesting. We cannot show it with any documentation. In the 2003 restoration, to celebrate the centennial of Buñuel, we organized an exhibition. We created a DVD box set with the restoration. There are two possibilities. You can have a soundtrack and with the two pieces of music, and another instead possibility of listening only to the Wagner. But I don't know if we can do that, because this is scientifically not correct, because this is an hypothesis. We still do have some time, so I would like let's think about Marián, that after a lockdown here, this restoration was made during lockdown, and the Madrid Film Archives, we can only call each other through Zoom, video conference, and I would like that you send a well wish to Marián, who could not come here because of the COVID. She's quarantining. Questions for the previous film, for Fake, and also for Ancien Andalou. How did you get the funds from Creative Europe? Because I knew that this was for the creation of new movies and not for restoration. So what did you restore from the negative? And another question. I did not understand the first question concerning the funding of the film. The funding for the grain, the other question. No, we did not compensate. We had the negative, which we did not touch. And as regards the old master, it underwent the grain reduction, perhaps. But we did not touch this aspect because we wanted to preserve this archival trait as a sort of a documentation. So we did not want to touch that. So, of course, we talked about grading. And also, as let us go back to the funds, if everyone has understood what we've been saying. Well, we filled the document, which is necessary in order to get the rightful funding. The project of restoration was presented that would have a dissemination on 35mm and digital format. So we're about 80,000, 100,000 euro as a fund. So the project funding consists in having several archives collaborating, but also to look at funds for CNC, because you need lots of, you have to comply to a lot, to many constraints. So you have to establish a company with a majority shareholding from France. But we looked at funds from Europe, from the European Union. It was a really time-consuming effort, but we succeeded because this is a movie with a very strong European character. I don't want to get into details about these procedures. You have to try them.
Hoe accès au négatif original 16 mm
The access to the 60mm negative, as Jérôme said, this is a composite element mixed. They were seen at 65mm. They was blown to 35mm, put into negative. That's why we have negative dupes, all of them there. And so we retrieved some 16 negatives. They were 4% of the blown over to 35 in order to keep the same texture and same leveling of images. We remained and we worked on the negative dupe, because if you find the 16 negatives, of course, there will be an ethical issue on this restoration work, because the film was blown to 35. So the grain is quite clear-cut. And with the 16 negative, we could have a digital restoration smooth. But the film would lose its meaning. That is to say, the meaning of Orson Welles and in the editing. So fortunately, we found that otherwise we would have a very long, drawn discussion. Well, thank you, Ferran. Without you, this restoration shouldn't have been possible in this way. Thank you for your contribution, which was vital. You are a reference point. Thank you very much for all you've done. Thank you to the audience.